Yeah, welcome. Again, my name is Bryant Baker. I have been working with Los Padres ForestWatch since 2016. I've spent a lot of time uh, looking at condor data. You're going to see that really clearly here pretty soon. I have gone through a lot of historical records and read books and all sorts of stuff. All of this is to say, I'm not actually a condor expert or a condor biologist. This is just something that I find really fascinating, and my area of expertise is actually more with data, GIS data especially, and I really a lot of my work revolves around wildfire actually, but condors I really like. Condors, I love looking at condor tracking data, and I'm going to show you a lot of that later. But one of the things that I really just want to uh, convey in this presentation is this story about how condors almost went extinct. The story about how we kind of brought them back from extinction, I think, is told really well in a lot of different ways by different people that are much more qualified. But what we don't hear as much is like, why did condors almost go extinct? And so I'm going to really delve into that in this presentation. So here are some really cool historical uh, documents, some books that I recommend if you ever can find a way to get your hands on these. These have a wealth of information from back at the time when condors were still in the wild, before they had been taken out of the wild to start the captive breeding program. One that I think is really important is the California Condor by Carl Coford in 1953. I'll talk more about that later, and you're going to see a lot of his work sort of come back multiple times. But there are some really cool other books that I think have a lot of valuable information in them as well. Again, if you want to learn more about that story of how we collectively as a society, and mainly as scientists and conservationists, how people brought this species back from the brink of extinction, I'm not going to go into that much, and so I recommend this book, Return of the Condor by John Moore, or Moyer, I think is how you say his name. We sell this in our online store. You can go check it out, buy it. We have a little discounted price. So yeah, check that book out. It's a great book. And yeah, that's our link to our online store, store.forestwatch.org. So let's get started. As with all good stories, this one starts with an asteroid. And we're probably all familiar with that asteroid, I think, the one that did a kind of a number on the dinosaurs back about 66 million years ago, I think is now the new, we've said for a long time it was 65 million years ago. There's even a movie called 65, I think, with Adam Driver, and it's about dinosaurs. It's a weird sci-fi movie, but it was actually 66 million years ago. That's sort of the newer number that's out in the literature. Anyway, that is sort of besides the point. What I really want you to know from this is that we're all familiar with this asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. Of course, the non-avian dinosaurs were the ones that were really affected by that event. The avian dinosaurs, there were actually some of those persisted. And at about 61 million years ago, so several million years after the asteroid impact, you see some differentiation in whatever avian dinosaurs survived. You start to see them split up into the cathartids, which are the New World vultures, is what we call them. And then there was this other sort of path that ended up being the hawks and the secretary birds and the ospreys. So we're going to follow this little path down here. And what's really interesting is that in the Eocene, especially, we see the rise of large mammals on the landscape. And when you have large mammals on the landscape, you have large dead mammals on the landscape as well. And where you have big dead animals, where you have carcasses, you have scavengers. And so this is what allowed the vultures, these scavenging birds, to really start to develop into different groups and species. And if we go back to about 17 million years ago, we can see where there's this important differentiation happening. We've got the turkey vulture genus, the Cathartes. It starts to develop and kind of go its own way. And then you've got this other branch that ends up being these two genera, vulture and gymnogyps. This one here, vulture, it is today characterized by the Andean condor, and then there's this relative in the gymnogyps genus, which is the California condor. That's the only surviving species in this genus. And something interesting about all of this is that we see California condors. There's some more recent paleo research that has shown that maybe California condors, are actually evolving more recently than we thought. So within the last 10,000 years, back in the Pleistocene era, there were actually several different species of condors in the Gymnogyps genus, and those have all since gone extinct, of course, and the California condor is what we have left. So now I want to just kind of talk about some of the more recent history with California condors. So obviously, up until colonization of Western North America, we had Paleo Indians and later Native Americans they were living among California condors since the late Pleistocene, so for many thousands of years. We don't have any reason to believe that condor populations were declining during that period. It's really hard to say, but condor populations were probably doing just fine. So we did have this period of many thousands of years where humans were living on the landscape with condors, and we weren't driving condors to extinction. Now, all of that's going to start changing really rapidly in just the last couple of hundred years. But there are some interesting things to note here. So 1602 was actually the first time that California condors were seen by non-indigenous people, and at least they were seen and it was written about. This was almost certainly the first sighting of condors by Europeans, and this was in Monterey Bay. And it was on this expedition where these guys didn't even really get off their boats. They were just kind of going up the coast. And I believe they saw a bunch of condors feeding on like a whale carcass in the Monterey Bay area. And they wrote about it and they thought, yeah, those are some interesting big birds over there. And so it would be 167 years later before Europeans saw condors again. And that was the Portola expedition. Interestingly, the way they saw condors on that expedition was it was a stuffed condor in a village that was along the Pajaro River, which feeds into Monterey Bay. So again, the Monterey Bay area, they're seeing condors. And if you know Spanish, Pajaro means bird. And the reason the Pajaro River is named that is because of this stuffed condor that was seen on this expedition. So you wouldn't necessarily think that river has any connection to condors in terms of its etymology, but it does, which is really cool. Yeah, the first condor specimen was collected and scientifically described in 1792. And then, the Lewis and Clark expedition, this is where we start seeing written records of condor observations by the Euro-Americans, the outside of California, really. And so they were seeing condors along the Columbia River on the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. And not only did they see them, they thought they were really big and interesting looking. So they, of course, shot them out of the sky to take a look at them, and they shot a bunch of them. And so, that is a theme you're going to see over and over, that people back then were just, I guess, curious, and their curiosity was expressed in shooting big birds out of the sky. So it wasn't very long, though. It was just a few decades later that condors became really rare in the Columbia River area. So we start seeing very few references to condors in the written record in that area. So there's evidence that by then their populations were already possibly declining up in the Pacific Northwest. Now, there's a lot of other interesting history here. 1890, condors become super rare or possibly even extirpated. They're not there at all anymore in the Monterey area. And remember, this is the place where non-indigenous folks first saw condors. So it wasn't that long in the grand scheme of things that people were seeing them there and then not seeing them there at all. And by 1910, condors were all but gone from they were not found really in anywhere but Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, and Kern County in California. Now, 1953, that's when Carl Coford published this first ever systematic study of condors. And it was a really, really important, it was basically a book that he published in 1953. And he estimated that about 60 condors remained. And then, of course, the last couple dozen condors were removed from the wild in 1987 for the captive breeding program. So just to sum it all up, it was only a few hundred years between the first sightings by Europeans and Americans of condors and their almost complete extinction. So not a very long time when you think about the many thousands of years that condors had been around before that. So, there's this other really interesting piece of this. In the 1930s, there was this period, right, where people kind of knew that condors were sort of declining. But in the 30s, there was this sort of fervor that maybe condors were actually bouncing back and they were doing just fine. And there's this really interesting article in the LA Times called "Oh, King Condor Live Forever." And I like to point this out because it's just a good reminder that we can't let our guard down in conservation, even when we think things are on the up and up. It's important to remember that things can go wrong very quickly. And so between the 1930s and the 1980s, just 50 years, we went from condors are doing great, they're bouncing back, everything's good, to we have to remove every single one of them from the wild so that we can breed them, or else they are going to go extinct. And that is a pretty big shift over just half a century. So this is the sort of crux of this presentation. Why did condors almost become extinct? It's not a story that is really told very often. I think we have kind of some ideas maybe in the back of our heads, like, oh yeah, they died for, maybe it was lead poisoning, it was people shooting them. I'm not really sure, all we know is that they almost went extinct. And so I'm going to just go into this a little bit more deeply than I think people usually do. So I'm a big nerd and spend a lot of time just looking over old historical records, particularly the newspaper record. I find to be really fascinating. And there's so many old newspapers are been digitized. They're online and available to look at if you're willing to pay a little bit of money. And so that's exactly what I did. I tried to find pretty much any instance I could in the 1800s and the 1900s of condors being mentioned, or particularly being shot or collected, killed. And I found a lot. There were a lot of newspaper articles about condors being shot, about them being collected, about eggs being found, all sorts of things. We have just this weird situation where people were kind of obsessed with shooting condors. They thought they were really interesting because they were big birds in the sky or out on, foraging on a carcass. And so you got, these guys that are just out, they're hunting for deer or something, and they see a big bird and they're like, I want to shoot that big bird. I got to know what that is. And then they realize it's a condor. They take it back into town. Everybody kind of oohs and ahs over that. They get it taxidermied. They think maybe I can sell this to a museum. Then you start seeing newspaper articles talking about how much, some of these specimens are worth, especially eggs. If you could find an egg in a nest, there are all sorts of people looking to buy eggs for their collections. And so we've got, these Burt Reynolds looking dude here in this interesting pose. I don't know what is going on. This is one of the more interesting photos I've ever seen in a newspaper article from from the early 1900s. But yeah, we see a lot of this, a lot of condors being shot in California, especially in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And so I kind of tallied all this up, and this is not perfect. This is not a complete data set. The newspaper record is incomplete. certainly. It does not we can't find every single instance of a condor being shot just by looking at old newspapers, but we can see that a lot of condors were being killed year after year in the late 1800s and a little bit in the early 1900s. And if you look at Coford's book from 1953, he also noted that he found that 60 eggs had been collected um, in this time period here. And that may not seem like a lot, but condors only really lay a pair will only lay one egg, and at most they'll do that every couple of years. And so it's not this 60 eggs, and that's just what we know of. Where that's just what Carl Coford knew of to be collected. There were probably lots of eggs that were in collections that he never came across. Uh, that really could have quite an impact on the population, as did, of course, all of this wanton shooting and capturing. There was a lot of capturing as well. People wanted pet condors. That was kind of a weird thing as well. And there were all sorts of weird myths and urban legends about condors developing in the late 1800s, especially. There's this great book, California Condor, Vanishing American, by Dick Smith and Robert Easton. So for those of you in the Santa Barbara area, you may be familiar with these names, kind of famous names in the conservation world here. They wrote this book in 1964, and it was a really interesting book. They have this great quote about how, the the condor was this boogeyman bird. It was kind of this menacing creature out there, and you can see this in newspaper articles with these crazy quotes, like they attack and carry off young deer and even young bears, or they would carry off children if any were to be found. To be clear, condors can't really carry anything when they fly. They do not do that. In fact, they don't even really carry carcasses. They will drag them on the ground. They'll drag pieces of them, but they're not flying off with anything. They don't have the talon grip strength, I think, for that, and they definitely don't carry off live things, because they do not eat living creatures. They very exclusively eat dead things. So this was just absolute nonsense. But that's what people were saying back then. It was a weird time. Also, we have some really cool photos in this presentation, thanks to Chris Trent. He is an amazing condor photographer who has been really gracious to me over the years, letting us use a lot of his photos for educational purposes. So thank you, Chris. I don't know, he might even be on this presentation or this webinar watching. Okay, so we know that people were literally shooting condors out of the sky. We know that they were capturing them, that they were collecting their eggs. So what else could have been going on? It wasn't just the fact that condors were being shot or captured. There were other things happening at the same exact time as well. And so this is one of the stranger things I came across. If you want a good background on this, go check out this Atlas Obscura article. It's just absolutely crazy. I almost thought it was a joke at first. This article is I grabbed a couple of things out of it, but there are some really strange things that people were putting out. It was like weird propaganda, and it was anti-squirrel propaganda, which I know sounds odd, and it was at kind of the same time as as our big world wars, right? And so people were like, we got our boys over fighting across the sea in the trenches, and we've got a battle here of our own against the menace, the scourge of the ground squirrels. And we don't have, obviously, our young lads that we've sent over across the sea to fight. That's a lot of our workforce. So what do we have left? A bunch of children. Let's maybe draft them into this battle. And that's quite literally what they did. It was a really strange thing, but they would basically take barley and lace it with poison and try to kill as many ground squirrels as they possibly could. And this had a lot to do with the fact that in the 1800s, it was all about ranching. It was about livestock in California. But as at the turn of the century, we start seeing row crop agriculture becoming a much bigger sort of part of our agricultural system, especially in the Central Valley and the San Joaquin Valley, those kind of places. And so ground squirrels were seen as this big economic problem because they were affecting crops, right, in this burgeoning agricultural system. So this was a really big deal at the time. And there is definitely evidence that condors, this is not something they would typically eat. Ground squirrels, that's really small carrion. But when you mass kill squirrels in these, sort of big colony systems, and they come out to eat the barley and they die very quickly, condors would see that as a food source. You've got a lot of small carcasses, but there were a bunch of them. And so it's possible, we don't know exactly how this was affecting them, but it is possible that this rodenticide was affecting condors that were feeding on these carcasses. Also, you've got to think there are some other animals that may have been feeding on these carcasses, and then those animals died, and condors may have fed on those subsequent animals, right? So you can always get this sort of bioaccumulation of these poisons, these chemicals in the food web. The other thing that we were doing at the time, and I say we, these were this is the royal we. I have no part in this. I was not alive at the time, nor were any of you. But we had a war that we were waging against coyotes as well, and this was really crazy to read some of these articles and read old government documents about how we got to get rid of coyotes, just killing absolutely massive amounts of coyotes. I saw this one report. It was a hunter who worked for the Bureau of Biological Survey. That's, if you want to read a really depressing document here, read this one. This was a report of the chief of the Bureau of Biological Survey in 1931. And you may not be familiar with this agency because it didn't really last that long, but it ultimately sort of evolved into the Fish and Wildlife Service. It used to be in the USDA, and then it kind of got moved over to the Department of Interior. Interesting history there. But in this report, there was this one instance where it was talking about this hunter who worked for the Bureau of Biological Survey, and he killed 176 coyotes in a single month in one small area of Washington state. That was just like, hey, this guy did really good. What else was going on across the rest of the country? We can only imagine. It's really crazy what they were doing. But part of this effort was also to use poison. What they would do is they would lace carcasses with strychnine, I think was the main thing they were using then. And they would put these carcasses out to try to attract coyotes. And the coyotes would eat these poison carcasses, and then they would die. So you got to imagine condors out in the landscape, they were seeing these carcasses, these strychnine laced carcasses. They were feeding on those probably before the coyotes got to them. Or they were also feeding on the coyotes that were poisoned from those carcasses. So again, we have these different ways that these potentially dangerous pests, these chemicals, these poisons getting into the food web and getting to California condors. Also, some of you may remember this, DDT. This was a big issue in the first half of the 20th century, especially. And so we were spraying a lot of DDT all over the landscape. And of course, we know now, thanks in large part to Rachel Carson. If you've ever read Silent Spring, this is what this was really about. What we were finding back in the mid-century was that these DDT metabolites, like DDE, for example, were causing eggshell thinning, especially in the main bird. I think of the topic in Rachel Carson's book was it was about bald eagles mostly, but condors were also being heavily affected by this as well. And there's this really seminal paper in 1979 that found that condors were among the most sensitive of bird species to this issue of eggshell thinning because of this DDT metabolite, DDE. And you can see this is amazing. This is from 1979. This is such a cool figure. It's still one of the coolest figures I've seen in a scientific paper. And I say cool as in it's interesting, it's fascinating. It's obviously not a good thing. It's not a cool thing, and so to speak. But you can really see this thinning. And so that obviously caused issues for a number of reasons, and it led to lower reproductive rates, successful hatching of these of condors. Now, we've gotten a handle on that to some extent, especially in terrestrial ecosystems, but we still see that there's eggshell thinning happening in coastal populations of condors, because they are often able to opportunistically feed on marine mammal carcasses that wash up on the beach. And in marine systems, there's been more sort of bioaccumulation of these DDT metabolites, so they're persisting longer there, and this has become an issue for these coastal populations. It's getting better, but it's still a problem. There's this other interesting thing that's been happening for a long time. I think we've, it's better than it used to be, but microtrash ingestion was a problem. Condors are just very curious birds, and so you'd sometimes see adults they would actually ingest these odd, little pieces of glass and bottle caps and all sorts of weird stuff. They would then regurgitate their food, to their chicks in the nest. And some of that would have those pieces of microtrash, and then the chicks would eat that, but they don't regurgitate food the same way. And so they would sort of accumulate this microtrash in their gut, and then they'd have to get that surgically removed. It was a whole big problem. But we don't see that nearly as much anymore, thanks in large part to, I think, efforts to try to reduce the prevalence of microtrash in their current range. That's something that ForestWatch we've been doing for a long time, is going and cleaning up microtrash at old target shooting sites in the Los Padres National Forest. Okay, so this is the big one. Lead. What's lead got to do with it? Okay, this is an interesting story. So there was this revolution in gun technology, and it kind of started with the Winchester model, 1894. This was the sort of first mass available, to the public gun that used smokeless powder cartridges. So this was a repeating rifle, very easy to use, smokeless powder cartridges, made things a lot more simple to go out and shoot things, right? And so people were widely adopting this gun. And at first, we had these unjacketed bullets. And you can see there's the lead bullet, right? There's the casing, but they didn't have a jacket around the bullet. And because of the technology, I'm not going to really get into it. There's some fascinating history here. But basically, very, very quickly after smokeless powder cartridges were developed, gun makers realized that they needed to improve bullet design to work with this new technology. So what they came up with was these jacketed bullets. And so we have the lead sort of encased in copper usually. So that's the jacket around the lead bullet. Now, eventually these soft point bullets were developed, right? So that a little bit of the lead is exposed at the top. And what this did is it made the bullet, it made the impact, like when it would impact a tissue, right? It would very easily sort of deform and spread, and that would cause more damage, which would kill something quicker, more efficiently, right? That was the idea behind it. So it was good for hunting in that sense. It had this one problem though, which is that it also fragmented like crazy. And so what we see, you can see there's some really interesting studies that have been done where they look at the fragmentation rates of different types of bullets, but you can really see that what happens in the body that's being shot, it's a deer, let's say it's a deer, is the bullet causes tons of damage, kills the deer, and it leaves behind this sort of trail of lead fragments, very small. And so here's a really good example of this. This is I think, ballistic gel. This is a common, lead bullet, and there's all those fragments there. And then this is a non-lead bullet, and you can see it doesn't. We don't have that same fragmentation issue. So you can imagine this is kind of a problem, right? For all sorts of reasons. So one, you got these carcasses that have a bunch of little pieces of lead throughout them, and that can be an issue for people that are eating the meat from these carcasses. So that's one problem, but we're not going to get into that really. And you might think, okay, well, people were hunting so that they could collect this meat and go home and eat it. Why would there be a bunch of carcasses on the landscape from hunting that are available to condors? And it's not so much that carcasses were left on the landscape whole. That did happen sometimes. Sometimes people were not able to recover the animal that they shot. Maybe they didn't kill it immediately and it ran off and they couldn't find it. Sometimes people just wanted to collect, maybe the fur, the pelt, or the antlers or something. But more often than not, the real problem was that people were field dressing. They still do this. They field dress the animal that they've shot, and they collect the meat that they want to keep, and then they leave these gut piles behind, and those gut piles have tons of lead fragments in them, and the condors love these gut piles. Scavenging animals in general love these things, and so that is how they are ingesting. They're literally ingesting little pieces of lead, and those get into their digestive system, and they basically start to shut their digestive system down so that they become emaciated. It just causes so many problems biologically for condors and for other animals that ingest them. It's not just condors that experience this. So if we look at data, we do have some data here. This is the number of adult condors killed between 2013 and 2022. So this is just a decade worth of data that I was able to get a hold of. And you can see that lead poisoning among the different flocks. So we don't just have condors right now in Southern California or Central California. There have been populations have been reintroduced into Baja California and the Arizona, Utah area. There's also a new population up in Northwest California. I'll talk about that later. I just don't have any data for that. But lead poisoning, number one killer of condors. Missing in the wild, that's a close number two. A lot of that is probably going to be from lead poisoning as well. The condor got emaciated, it went off and died somewhere, and condor biologists couldn't find that carcass. And so a lot of this is going to be lead poisoning. Undetermined, probably a lot of that is lead poisoning as well. You can see that these other things just not nearly as big of an issue as lead. And so lead poisoning for sure is the number one problem affecting condors today. And in fact, what the Fish and Wildlife Service has to do, and other groups, I mean, the Ventana Wildlife Society, they're all working together to try to, keep these condors alive out in the wild. One of the things they have to do is they have to often capture them and treat them for lead poisoning through something called lead, or I think it's called chelation. And so condors are really struggling to be out in the wild completely on their own because they still have to get treated for lead poisoning. So there have been these different methods for trying to reduce the use of lead by hunters. So there's these voluntary methods. There's also like actual lead ammunition bans. We tried that in California. In the range of the condor, there was this ban implemented in 2008, and that didn't seem to do a whole lot. There's still a lot of lead poisoning happening, obviously. We had the statewide ban that was phased in fully in 2019. And it's unclear how much that is doing. The problem is we have these bans, and they ban lead ammunition for hunting, but they still allow gun stores to sell lead ammunition for target shooting. So it's very easy to still buy lead ammunition, and not everyone is going to comply with the ban on hunting. So people are definitely still using lead ammunition for hunting. And that is still obviously a really big issue. If we just look at the California flocks, we can really see the lead poisoning issue here more in focus. Again, missing in the wild, a lot of that's going to be lead poisoning as well. So it is just outright. I mean, it's definitely the big killer. Just in the last couple of years since that statewide ban went into place, we still have a ton of condors that are dying from lead poisoning. So there's more work that has to be done, and it probably has a lot to do with changing the mindset of people that are using lead ammunition. How can we get people to start adopting non-lead ammunition? And I made the mistake, or maybe, I don't know if it was a mistake, but I went through some like hunting forums online just to sort of see, I was trying to figure out like what do people think about these bans and stuff. And it's interesting to say the least. There are a lot of people that they don't care about condors. They certainly don't want to use non-lead. They don't want to be told to use non-lead ammunition, and that's definitely a problem. That's definitely an issue. I am really glad to see, though, when I look through these forums, there are hunters out there that are very much pro non-lead ammunition. I think this person, I mean, it's just a quote from a complete stranger on the internet, but it was actually quite inspiring. Talking about as the hunters need to have, they should have banned lead ammunition long time ago because they are ultimately conservationists. They want to protect wild places and have animals out there that they can hunt. And he had this quote: "You need to love the natural environment more than your lead bullets." And I think a lot of the solution in this issue is going to rely on people like this to change the culture from within. But I don't have all the answers for that. Let's get into start showing you some maps and stuff. This is a little less depressing. This is from Carl Coford's 1953 book about condors, and he really delineated this area that was sort of their last stronghold at this time that their populations had declined rapidly. And so he's got these areas that were, let's see here. I'm going to just sort of add this to this map of the Los Padres National Forest so you can see where this is. So yeah, Santa Barbara down here, Ventura, Oxnard over here. This is the 5. Okay, we're all sort of understanding what we're looking at here. These dark circles, those are what he determined were really important roosting areas. And then he also found some areas that were important for nesting. And this was between 1935 and 1950. So there were still dozens of condors out in the wild. But they were, of course, declining, and these were the really important places for them. And ultimately, it was this work that really led to the establishment of some condor sanctuaries. So we have the Sespe Condor Sanctuary and the Sisquoc Condor Sanctuary. To this day, these are the only condor sanctuaries on federal land that are in existence. And in these places, like, we cannot go in there. You can't hike in there. You can't ride your bike in there. I mean, you cannot go in there as a person unless you have special permission. Usually biologists are allowed to go in there to check on the condors. Anyway, these are really important places for California condors. You'll see that more in the data here in a bit. Sisquoc Condor Sanctuary, that was established in 1937, and the Sespe Condor Sanctuary was established in 1947. So you can see Coford was right on the money with where are these important areas, and that's where we decided to make these sanctuaries. Same with what's called critical habitat. So the Fish and Wildlife Service, after the species was designated as endangered under the Endangered Species Act, they also designated critical habitat. And so a lot of that critical habitat, it lines up with where Coford was finding condor activity to be the highest before we removed them from the wild. And you'll see that this range of where they were at the end, it includes other really important landscapes that are protected in various ways. We've got wilderness areas in the Los Padres National Forest, the Carrizo Plain National Monument, the Giant Sequoia National Monument. We have some private preserves like Wind Wolves and Tejon Ranch. And then the National Wildlife Refuges, we've got Bitter Creek and Hopper Mountain, and those were really established specifically for condor reintroduction efforts to protect condors. So if we kind of zoom out, so we have established populations in other areas in the country. And so the first time I ever saw condors actually was as a kid. I think I was maybe 14 or 15 years old on a trip to the Grand Canyon. I grew up in Arkansas, so we weren't really exposed to the condors much. And I actually got to see two condors flying around in the Grand Canyon that a Park Service employee was pointing out to a crowd. It was really cool. And so that was back in the early days, not long after they had been reintroduced. So yeah, condors are, They're in a lot of different places now. The population is still not huge in any of these areas, but they are out there, and there's still a lot of work happening to try to keep them alive in these places. Okay, this is a quote from one of my favorite shows of all time. I just thought it was funny. If you know where this is from, then you know. Um, that was good. So let's look at some serious data here, though. This is condor tracking data from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the last year that I have data for all of the flocks in California was 2020. So that includes the Central California flock and the Southern California flock, which there's like 3 different data sets basically that make this up. These areas up here, I'm not able to access these data, the newer data for these. So anyway, this still gives a good sense of where condors are on the landscape. So these are tracking their movements across the landscape. So every point is it's a condor that is somewhere on the landscape doing something. It's either flying or it's perching, it's roosting, whatever. So lots of data, literally like millions of points here. Now I can take all those points and create this density map. And so you can see where the points tend to cluster, right? And so obviously we see, I think I've got, let's see here. No, maybe not. You can see that there's some serious clustering in the Sespe Condor Sanctuary, and then in the Tehachapi Mountains, really important areas for condors. Of course, up in the Big Sur region and in the Pinnacles area here. There are definitely places in the Los Padres National Forest where condors just aren't very active at all, like the Western San Ynez Mountains, or up here in the Southern Santa Lucia Mountains up by San Luis Obispo. But they're also kind of really getting up into the Sierra Nevada these days, which is great. I think I just wanted to show you the satellite imagery here, so you can see that they're kind of avoiding the Central Valley. Historically, they probably were going into the Central Valley quite a bit for foraging purposes, because there would have been a lot of deer and elk that were dying out there at some point, and they were finding carrion. But now that it's mostly row crop agriculture and oil fields and stuff, it's not as hospitable of a place for foraging. And again, we can look at that historical range that Coford created, and they are definitely really active within that historical range. They've expanded beyond that, kind of back into some territory that they would have been probably more historically active in, like the 1800s. But they're really utilizing the same place that they were before those last few condors were taken out of the wild for the captive breeding program, which I find very, very interesting. We can also look at stationary points. So these are where we would see condors like roosting or nesting. And again, we see the Sespe Condor Sanctuary, Hopper Mountain Wildlife National Wildlife Refuge, very important area. But you can see these other sort of clusters that are really cool to kind of see where those are on the landscape. And again, here is those areas that Coford sort of identified. Now you'll notice not as much activity up in these couple of points, that these areas that Coford had said were really important roosting areas, not as much stationary activity. So probably not a lot of roosting going on currently, but it does seem like they are moving back into this area. And you'll see that I'm going to show you some 2023 data, which is the most recent data I have. That'll be kind of interesting. And it actually was not that long ago that condors really were kind of just getting back into Santa Barbara County and spending more time there. And so in 2018, that was the first time that a wild condor had fledged in Santa Barbara County since 1982, which is amazing. And so there's definitely movement into some of these areas where they haven't been as active in recent decades, which is a really good sign. This is a photo of that same bird. This is Condor 933. Again, Chris Trent, thank you for all these wonderful photos. I often just email him and say, "Do you have a photo of Condor so and so?" And he's like, "Yeah, I've got a picture of that beautiful specimen," and it's just amazing. I believe, yeah. So this Condor 933, its father was AC4, who is like the OG Condor. He was back, he was out in the wild when they started the captive breeding program. He's 44 years old. He'll be 45 in a few months. Like, it's just, this is an incredible Condor. He's just still going. He's had 30 offspring. I think that we know of. A lot of that was in the captive breeding program, but also in the wild. So he is a very important condor for sort of pushing the boundaries here. So look, again, this is that activity, the condor tracking point density map. And I want to show you just AC4's his density map. So we just are isolating his points. And his stomping grounds, I don't know if that's the right word for a flying creature, but his I don't know what the word, his flapping grounds, his flapping area is the Sisquat Condor Sanctuary. Big fan of the Sisquat Condor Sanctuary. Does not spend really any time in the Sespe Condor Sanctuary. Goes up into the Sierra Nevada a little bit, but he's really getting condors to kind of move back into Santa Barbara County, which is awesome. Now, this is from 2023. Again, I don't have data for the flock that's up here. So we're just looking at the Southern California flock. And the 2023 data is really interesting. We can see there's a lot of activity up in the very northern part of their current range in California, with the exception of the new population that has been established up in the northwestern corner of California. But yeah, they're getting all the way up here into the Yosemite area, which is just fascinating. And they're starting to sort of cross the Sierra Nevada crest, which is really cool too. And I want to talk about a couple of like individual flights that I find to be very, very interesting. So this is this bird, Condor 811. Her name is Luluti. And in 2019, she actually crossed the Central Valley. I think she started in Windward's Preserve and then kind of flew up to the Machesna Mountain area and then decided she wanted to go check out the Sierra Nevada. And so she crossed the valley. And we can look at the mileage here. This was in a single day, 165 miles across not the most pleasant of landscapes. I mean, we're talking oil fields, row crop agriculture, pretty close to Bakersfield, not the best air quality. And she did it all in one day. Really, really impressive. This bird is just, she's really fascinating to me. She's kind of pushing the boundaries as well. She goes really far north in terms of condor activity. She goes pretty far north. A lot of condors don't really get up in this area. But one of the things that I love about her is that she seems to be a ham for the camera. I don't think she does this on purpose, but back in 2023. So this is all of basically what I did is I took all of those points and I created like a track, for all of the points throughout the year. And so this is her track. This is basically her movement throughout 2023. And there's this little spot right here that doesn't seem like anything important, but in July of last year, she was seen on the alert camera system. She was up on this tower looking right into the camera. I do not think she knows what cameras are or what was going on, but this was a really fun little thing that happened. And what's so cool is that we can actually look at the data. So I actually got the data for that day. It was March 23rd. No, I don't know what day it was. Anyway, I figured out, oh yeah, July, it might've been July 18th. Yeah. There are all her points clustered on the Blue Mountain tower. So you can literally see that's where the camera is right there. I just thought that was so cool. Another condor did some really cool stuff back in 2020. This is Condor 828. Started in Pinnacles National Monument, flew down to the Carrizo Plains Ecological Reserve in a single day in July, flying south, not even for the winter, just flying south for the fun of it. The next day flew over kind of into the Angeles National Forest and then to the Sespe Wilderness, and then went over by the Sisquat Condor Sanctuary. So it was really hanging out in the San Rafael Wilderness and the Dick Smith Wilderness, and then flew back north over the next 2 days, all the way back to Pinnacles. So that is quite a trip, 830 miles round trip, just in 5 days. That is amazing, that this condor did this. And you can see she hit a lot of, I believe it was a she. I have her note. Yeah. Okay. So this is cool. I wrote this down earlier. She was the first condor that was wild fledged in Pinnacles. So she's just a real, she's pushing the boundaries. She's doing some really cool things here. So she flew down here, right, and then she was hitting a lot of these spots that Koford had identified as important. And then in August, just a month later, she did it kind of again. She flew down to Sisquoc Condor Sanctuary and then up to Big Sur. And she was also found up in the Mount Diablo area, which is, I think, as far north as any condor had gone on this side of the Central Valley, which is just absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, she died from lead poisoning in 2022. So this is a problem, right? We have these condors that are really expanding territory, going back into these historically, active areas, and they're doing it on their own. They're wild fledged. It's not like they know to go do this. I don't know that other condors are teaching them, and then they're dying from lead poisoning. And so you can see how that could be a major problem going forward. And someone's asking, why do they make these extended round trips? That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. There might be some condor biologists that know the answer. And if you want to chime in the chat, I don't know if Chris Trent, maybe you know, but I imagine they are exploring. They're looking for new foraging grounds. They're just, I don't know, birds. If I were a bird and I could fly, I would do the same thing, I think, especially if I could soar for long distances at a time. Now, this is from 2022, Condor 939. This was a cool trip that I found. Again, another big trip to Big Sur, and then all the way up to Giant Sequoia, just in a matter of, I think, a week or so. And interestingly, historically, condors were definitely active in giant sequoias. We know that they were roosting. They're probably nesting in these big cavities in sequoias. Obviously, they disappeared from that area before they were taken out of the wild for the captive breeding program. But they do this still in redwoods for sure, coast redwoods, which are similar to sequoias, obviously a related species. They do these, especially in these big fire-created cavities in the Big Sur area. They'll nest there and they'll roost there for sure. Here's another good, this was a nest. They actually had a nest cam. The Ventana Wildlife Society had a nest cam on this tree. And so you can see the egg right there. And this is likely a condor on an egg, maybe. I'm not really sure. I forget where I got these photos. Okay, so Condor 939, yeah, did that. That was a really cool trip. And then same year, I just was kind of illustrating the extent of condor activity in 2022. Geographically, this other bird, Condor 949, flew up to Yosemite. So this is like Yosemite Valley up here, which is just absolutely amazing that they're getting up into Yosemite. People don't talk about that as much, but they are definitely getting up into this central part of the Sierra Nevada. Now, these are data from 2023. So these are for 3 different condors. And it shows all of their movement activity in 2023. And so they are definitely spending, they're going up into Yosemite, that area. They're also going through Giant Sequoia National Monument and Sequoia National Park. So they're really getting around these condors, which is great to see that they're doing this in 2023. There are these two condors that I want to just point out that are kind of fun. They have a very similar activity zone, and you can actually see, if you look really closely, their lines overlap like almost exactly on a couple of routes. You can see there and there, and so I was kind of curious when I saw that, and so I put this together last night. Actually, I was looking at the data again, and so this is Condor 939 and Condor 950. It's a male and a female, and I do not remember which one is which. One was wild fledged, and one was born in the Los Angeles Zoo, and they're both about 6 years old. So they're kind of birds of a feather, so to speak. And you can see that in July of last year, they kind of linked up and they went on this little trek together on the sort of eastern side of the Southern Sierra. And they went into Sequoia National Park, and then crossed over Giant Sequoia National Monument, kind of sort of stayed together, kind of on the same path, but not really tightly together, for a couple more days. So I just thought that was a really fascinating little trip that they took. So they seem to be, I don't know if they're a pair. I don't know if they're, a mating pair or something, or if they're just buddies. I'm not really sure how that works in the condor world, but it is always heartening to see this. And just for fun, here are all of the lines, all of the activities for every single bird in the southern flock from 2023. There's so much data here, you can't even see all of it, but you can just see that there's a ton of activity in the southern Sierra Nevada and the Tehachapi Mountains, and then kind of in this area here. This is really sort of this important path right here, Sespe Condor Sanctuary up into the southern Sierra Nevada, and also over here. But there's a lot of movement into this Santa Barbara County area, and even up into San Luis Obispo County, which is great to see. Now, the last thing I want to show you, I love trying to really get deep into the data and see if I see anything interesting. And I was looking, I noticed, I don't remember what year this is, maybe 2022 or 2020. I cannot remember. It doesn't really matter. But I was looking at the data and I noticed that there were a lot of condor tracking points close to Ventura, kind of between Ventura and Ojai. So this is the Sulphur Mountain area, if you're familiar with that area. And I noticed there were a bunch of points. So I sort of zoomed in and was looking at these clusters. I'm like, okay, these are interesting. These are, clusters that make sense. That it's like where they're perching during the day in the trees. That all definitely makes sense. Kind of on some of these like cliffier areas. But these two were really sticking out to me because they're in this grassy area, right? This kind of pasturey area. And so let's isolate those and zoom in here. And you see there's these two distinct clusters, right? And I looked, all of these points are from the same week, basically. And these are all, you can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different birds, 9 different condors that are doing this. And if we were doing this in person, I would ask you, what do you think is going on here? And everybody would say, oh, they're foraging, they're eating something, right? And yes, that's probably almost exactly, I'm fairly confident that's exactly what was happening, that there was a carcass here, maybe 2. Maybe it could have been that there was 1 carcass and then part of it got dragged over here. Could have been a stillborn calf. There are cattle around here. It could have been dead deer. It could have been anything, right? But what we see is that a bunch of condors were feeding on this. And this is really an interesting thing to see. And it's totally normal. It's exactly what we would expect. Why I want to show you this is because look at how many different condors are here. And imagine that these carcasses were poisoned somehow, whether they had lead fragments in them or they had rodenticide, something that could affect, whatever was eating them. It could really impact a lot of condors at once, just in a matter of days. And we see that actually a couple of these are, one is definitely dead, and I don't remember, undetermined. So it could have been lead poisoning, could be something else. And then another one I think was missing in the wild and was possibly deceased. I haven't checked up on 938, but I don't know what the status is of that condor. Anyway, this is why it's such a problem if carcasses are contaminated. And also what's kind of cool here though, is I was looking at the satellite imagery from after that happened, from right after, and you can actually see these sort of bald spots on this grassy landscape. And that's almost certainly where there was carcass decomposition and all this activity from condors and maybe other scavengers as well. So just really interesting. This is what that would have looked like. This is another great photo from Chris Trent of some condors feeding on a carcass. And there's actually 933 again. That's our our bird that was the first one that was wild fledged in Santa Barbara County. So yeah, I'm going to end it there and see if we've got any questions. I know people have been kind of talking in the chat, and I'll just open it up to questions. What do you have for me?